All right. Well, good morning, Nick,
Morning, Matt. Good to see you.
and good morning to everyone out there. We're here another Vogue Academy talk, and today's topic is reading in college. Nick led a workshop at Princeton University last year on this, and has just started another one this fall. That's correct, right? Just started.
Yeah, it's a seminar, so it's a series of 5 workshops. But yeah,
Awesome. And we just thought it'd be great to kind of circle back to this topic. We did cover reading in a previous talk a couple weeks ago, a couple months ago even. But anyway, Nick, I want to make sure you have the floor, and so I yield to you. Off you go.
all right, Matt. Well, I'm just going to give this is a great way to get engagement with our conversation here, but a little warning, never ask someone about their PhD research because you get a long, convoluted answer that's really hard to understand and follow. And but this is my doctoral related research, but I'll do my best not to digress.
Hang on, I'm just getting comfortable in my chair so I can sit back and listen here. Yeah, I'm good. Off you
the
go.
second cup of coffee. Go, load up. So I'll try to make it interesting. I mean, I can't teach a class. That's not the point. Reading certainly is a big topic right now, and at the college level and all kinds of levels. Matt, you have some experience that in your own background. But I think one of the things that I think about working with adults, and that's a pretty different context than working with kids and teaching you how to read at that level, is, of course, you can address the processes, the mental processes and the social context of reading in a way that explicitly, that with kids, you're not doing that. You're sort of conditioning them or socializing them, you're engaging in activities, but this meta conversation is not really available to you. Yet most people, after they learn to read and they got the instruction to read, have got almost very, very little instruction in reading. And their processes are highly automatic and unconscious, and they're unaware of them, and they may have adapted and adjusted effectively and kind of kept up with the context and demands and the variety, but they may not have. Just to give one example, a lot of people who do have technical fields or engineers learn very particular ways of reading these materials that they work with, and then that becomes how they read everything, rather than recognizing different situations or different contexts. And so one of the reasons to help people think about reading in ways that is to help them read in more flexible ways and adapt and adjust and be aware sort of what the knobs are that they're turning up and down, and what's the situational context that they want to be responsive to develop an approach. And so I think that in that sense, teaching adults in college and beyond how to read more effectively is actually fairly similar from a theoretical point of view to doing research and talking with other research. You're trying to help people understand what is this thing called reading, and then how do you use that knowledge to read better and learn. And specifically in my case, in the college context, is learn from the text, which is a different thing. Learning and then using what you learn from your acts of reading in these contexts, and that expands our vantage point in a variety of ways. So I guess one of the first things I'd say, and then also a lot of people aren't aware that there's a lot of different ways to conceptualize reading. There's anthropologists who study reading. There's sociolinguists. There's certainly a physiological or neuroscientific point of view, cognitive, behavioral. Reading, some cases, includes translating symbols to sound. So there's even a phonological or approach. To me, this is fascinating. So I'm just going to pause here. I can already see Matt's eyes. No, I'm
I'm there.
All right. So, thinking, and I think a lot of people I'll do one digression. A lot of people think about reading in terms of how kids learn to read, and then what's the best way to teach them to read. And there's a few about the science of reading, and there's this big thing on Sold a Story, which is a kind of muckraking podcast, and it got a lot of attention, and people are asking me, oh, you study reading? I'm not going to get into that. You can go look at that someplace else. What I want to do is say that in the university and college context is a particular kind of reading. And in terms of that controversy going around, there's these articles called Students Can't Read, they don't know how to read. I would just want to say that one starting point is there are unique, distinctive features of college and university reading. Reading isn't just reading. It's not a universal thing. And if you want to understand why and how students read well or don't, you actually have to examine this context, the text, these kinds of readings they're asked to do, and then what students are coming with. Rather than just pointing fingers and saying they can't do this thing that I want them to do, which is often what professors do. So for instance, well, we'll pause there. Questions, thought that spark anything on your end, Matt?
Yeah, well, um, we can you provide a definition of reading then? I mean, given that there's all these contexts, I'm just curious, like we're reading, like we all think, oh, I know what it means to read, but then maybe I don't know what it means to read.
That's a great starting point. I would say for about 5 years in grad school, I just had this question on a loop in my head. What is reading? What is reading? What is reading? So in some sense, your definition depends on your perspective. So I was alluding to this different theoretical perspectives, right? So
Right.
I think when I went into grad school, I had a very cognitivist point of view, and I think that's very valuable, and I continue to use that a lot. So meaning, what are the cognitive processes involved in making sense of texts? So there's a lot of inferencing. You're actually reading is a lot of reasoning. So the cognitive processes, you're making connections across time. There's of course a memory component. At the very least, and then there's other more fundamental cognitive processes of like looking at symbols and turning those into sounds. But reading, I think, is equally thought of as social interaction that happens to be written down. And I actually think that's, to expand people's perspective, that's probably the more useful lens. Particularly college students who have, and adults who have this capability to say, okay, so a text is social interaction written down, so language happens to be written down. One of the first things that I think follows from that is if you're having trouble reading, if you think about it that way, you don't say, what's wrong with people's brains? They can't read. Like if you were in a conversation with someone, they didn't understand, you would say, what's wrong with, you wouldn't first go to what's wrong with their brain. You'd say, oh, we don't have a shared context, or they don't know, they don't have a sense of the purpose, or they don't have the knowledge that I have, or they don't know why I'm saying this. I think that's actually a more useful starting point.
Okay. Yeah, no, I hear that. I think I can think of the philosophy seminars that I've been in where we just dive right into the text and you're like, whoa, wait a minute. Like I've been given no context to understand what the issue is here. Like I remember we did, I was in a PhD seminar on Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. And it was just, we were looking at the English text, the German text, and we're just like analyzing every word. We would get through like 3 pages in 3 hours. And I'm sitting there the whole time like, I don't even know why you wrote this book. Yeah. So I needed that in order to really be able to dive in deep. So to your point.
And I'm not sure at the time if you had this recognition, but lots of people don't recognize that that's a question that they could answer.
Right.
And then it's actually a important and quite legitimate question, and actually a quite useful question to answer that may not seem initially or directly related to comprehending the words or sentences or paragraphs, but in fact is really crucial. So one big idea, for instance, I would say is reading is a bottom-up process. People tend to emphasize that. Oh, I'm going to look at the letters, sound them out into words, string the words together into a sentence, and then string the sentences together into the paragraphs. And that reading is this kind of very incremental, linear process. Well, the text is that, and we decode the words. But in fact, what's going on here is not linear that way at all.
Right.
And so with a lot of those are might call bottom-up processes, working from the stimuli and the letters to the words. There's also top-down processes, meaning why is this written? What are they trying to achieve? Who are they speaking to? What are the conventions of this field? What do these texts do, right? How's the author likely to do it? They're going to make a state a thesis. Then at some point, there's going to be subclaims and evidence, and what kind of evidence and what would persuade me. These are all top-down processes, and a lot of them build upon knowledge that's not in the text. So one of the big ideas too is texts are not themselves complete. right? They are the raw material. They're the stuff in the IKEA box. It's all stacked up there. But you got to put it all together with what? Knowledge, tools, processes
Hmm.
that are inherent in you or are not. And therefore, the text doesn't make sense.
Right.
Or you don't even, you may even have it, but you don't recognize you're supposed to bring it.
So is this, so in your seminars and workshops, are you kind of trying to enlighten students to that dynamic? Is that
Absolutely.
okay?
So let's take that's a great question. So let's take that and direct it to university reading in particular. So there's lots of kinds of readings. You could read your text on your phone, has certain features, very short, usually very personal, a lot of shared context, not a particular, the purpose is not to teach you things typically. So not only shared context, but shared knowledge, all the vocabulary more or less, except I don't always know what the abbreviations mean when my daughter texts me, but you can usually figure them out.
Right.
But the purpose of school is to learn things you don't know. So the chances that you're going to read a text where you know all the words and know what they're talking about is very low. That would be the antithesis of education. So even the basic purpose of the kind of discourse in schooling is much of this, especially in university, is to teach you about things you do not know. Well, that's not the typical reading situation, actually.
Mm-hmm.
And it poses unique challenges in a variety of ways. One is you'd be surprised what percentage of words and concepts you need to understand to be able to follow a text and really stick with it without getting pretty frustrated. If you don't know 90% plus of what the text is about, it's hard to stay connected. That's a lot. So, and then there's, of course, the purposes for which you're reading. You're reading for somebody else's purpose. You didn't pick the text typically. You don't always know why they picked the text. You don't know what you're supposed to do with the text down the line. You often don't have an understanding of what I call what counts as a good reading. What does the professor have in their mind as their criteria and standards for this text? There's a lot of lack of clarity on the student's part. So we're starting to add up all these features of the reading situation that are unknown or unclear for students, that are challenging. To me, sometimes I'm amazed that people can make sense of these texts, actually.
Right.
So then let's look at the particular kinds of texts. So before I got to college, I never read a research article. I don't think I knew they existed. If you had said, and I've heard Princeton students say this, a book length nonfiction, discussion of a topic, I didn't have a word for that. And I've heard many Princeton students call them novels. They don't even have a term. I never read one in high school, short of, a biography of Jim Thorpe when I was, only nonfiction I read was about sports, I think. And then I read novels. But these different types of texts have particular conventions.
Mm-hmm.
That's why we call them genres. The genres have different conventions. They make assumptions. The authors use these features. And this gets to the interactive point. But if you don't know what the features are and what they're for, what they're designed to do, then you really can't do much with them. So like a textbook has all these features. There's little boxes that are set aside that have a little story. There's these diagrams, and then there's the heading, but then there's italicized words that are associated with a glossary that has these elaborate introductions and headings all throughout, and then it has a conclusion, and then there's all these are features that are designed to help you learn, but they can only work, number one, if you know how to use them, and then two, that you use them. And in fact, a lot of times these features are counterproductive because there's too many. But that's another story. That's a critique of publishing. The point is, at some point, you have to have knowledge of the genre conventions to use them strategically. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Um,
Do you find most students are receptive to that, or are they kind of like, like, or I know when I was in college and I saw like a little box to the right of the page, I was like, oh sweet, there's less text on this page. It'll take me less time to read it. That tended to be my attitude.
Yeah, I think I was like, okay, skip that. That's a little story that I don't need to know.
Exactly.
But depends on the class. I mean, I think people have there's a lot of different ways you can use a text and get from it
Right.
what you need.
Right.
And I think maybe this is a theme that would come to us. Then there's self-awareness. What do I need? What works for me? What's my pathway through? Here's an example. I think we know what you're talking about. These little boxes that have more like a narrative in a textbook.
Right.
So it could, I know you studied economics, so it could be a little mini case study that's more of like a situation. Okay, you could go through the book chapter, just read all of those in a line. Then you'd have the context, these little stories. Then you could read through the theory, connecting it. So you could read in a very non-linear manner. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And you might know that about yourself and say, I want to know the material, the concrete details, the material things, to have a context to relate this abstraction to, because that's how I learn. And that's what intrigues me. I got to know the relevance, and I want to have some specifics. I want to have that in mind as I read. And then I can also know, hey, these texts, they are written linearly, and in some sense, you read them linearly, but you don't have to. I can jump through and then go back to the beginning. Even that idea is often revolutionary for students.
Yeah, because I would think the idea of going through a text multiple times is like, what? Initially, I'd be like, oh my God, it'd be so much more time, when in fact, that's not the case. And often I would think myself, I was just trying to get through the reading. Like if I just got through the check, that's done, I've done my work, everything's good, versus really comprehension really wasn't necessarily the goal.
That's right.
Something done. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, we talked about that yesterday in the first week of the seminar. So there's a kind of completion mode. Do the reading.
Right.
Hey, I think I did that a lot. Maybe you and I and others, even though I was in completion mode, I still kind of learned stuff and I had pretty good memory. But a lot of times we have to have a very clear intention. So this is something I almost never hear about when talking about reading, is you have to have an intention, or you don't have to. It helps and is really important to have an intention, for instance, that some point you're going to produce something with the knowledge that you're gaining. In academic contexts, right? You're assigned because at some point you are going to write a paper, solve a problem, explain something, write an essay. In some way or another, the assumption is this material is related to that. And so you need to be able to produce something. Almost nobody has that in their mind, unless you're a scholar. You're reading and you're thinking, how am I going to use this? What am I going to do with it? How am I going to write? How's this going to fit in my dissertation? What article? What am I critiquing? I could use this methodologically. You're about production. But students are almost never thinking about production, unless they're writing to write an essay and they're like looking for quotes.
Right. So what are there techniques to have an intention? Like I could see having good questions that drives your interaction with the text. Are there other techniques, or is that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So establishing a purpose, like, okay, what do I why was this assigned? What am I going to expect it to do with it? What do I want to do with it? So it's important too to have your own level of that. What's interesting to me about it? And to be conscious of that, and then to look for it. And then one way to look for that and keep it forefront is to have a question or two that you formulate and keep that in the forefront of your mind, and then read to answer it. Other things you can do are periodically stop and say, okay, let me kind of summarize what I've read. How does it relate to my question? Maybe take a few notes, annotation.
Right.
A little bit different than most people do it. And then if you chunk the text in this way and you process that as a unit, that can kind of, you can then kind of reset your intention. Because a common problem is people
Mm,
read and then they're like, my mind is way far away.
right.
So it's hard to maintain that intention. So one way to maintain it is to periodically pause, process the text, and reset your intention.
Mm,
There's all kinds of little things. You might have a little old days, and I still do encourage people to read on paper, as a little post-it with a few pointers. Keep in mind, every time you turn the page, move the post-it so it's staring you in the face. Um, Something I think we said before, the hardest cognitive science saying the hardest thing to remember is to remember to remember.
mm, right.
Keeping that in your head, in your mind. So those are some methods, but I think you're right to say intention is kind of squishy. It's hard to maintain. How do I do that? I need some techniques. I need some ways to do that, particularly if it's new and unfamiliar material. I didn't choose it. Somebody else did. There's all these contexts. I've come to think lately that the hardest part of reading in school is reading for other people's expectations,
Mm,
especially for Princeton students, right? They're capable, highly capable readers. These people are getting 36s on the ACTs, and that's a perfect score, I think, and 800 on their verbal SAT. And they're like, I don't understand what's going on. I can't do the reading in this class. I mean, how do you understand that? One of the ways is because they're being asked to read for other people's expectations, and then they don't have a standard in their head that says, okay, I got it, or
right.
that's what I'm supposed to get, because that standard is in somebody else's head, the professor, and the professor hasn't made that very clear,
Mm,
or the students don't recognize the importance of having that criterion in their mind to say, okay, I got that. Now I got to go back and kind of figure that out before I can move on, or I'm done now, or the criterion of what's important in this text. A lot of students really struggle with that. Why was this assigned? I don't understand what's important.
right. And it's almost, and would I be right to say, just given the time I was teaching at Princeton, that they might have an inkling, but they just don't trust themselves? Because it's hard. It's hard to, like, as an 18-year-old, and
Yeah.
you've got
Mm.
4 classes and all that kind of stuff, and they know they're smart, but they're like performative smart, and you're asking to do this it's like almost, it's entirely different in ways of like really trying to comprehend and understand versus ingesting information and somehow,
Yeah.
packaging and bombing it out on a test. And that's a very different thing. And so to really trust yourself with this new type of reading. So if I can just give you an example, what I would encourage them to do in some of the classes, that like the ethics and classes that I taught, and religious classes, for all the text, I say, if you take an index card and you can't do micro writing, you have to just put down, what do you think the main thesis is, the main argument, and then maybe 2 or 3 points, and that's it. Boy, that was because they feel like they have to understand everything and they can't let anything go. That exercise was really illuminating to me how they struggled with it, because they
Yeah.
don't. Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm done.
Well, I would think so. I think you've hit on something really important, and I would say that these are very fundamentally different kinds of readings between most high school and
Right.
some university contexts, right? Some of that has to do with the texts themselves. They're not entirely expository. They're not just explaining something, and then the implicit idea is that you're supposed to understand the explanation and then be able to tell back, reproduce that explanation to somebody else on a test or what have you. This is kind of implicit in exposition. Textbooks are largely kind of agreed upon consensus knowledge. And so the student has an intention. Their default purpose is find out what the author meant, understand every main idea, because you could be tested on it in a multiple choice question, right?
Hmm.
Comprehensively, and then be able to address these things. But they often don't grasp the logic or how it's all fit together, because they're not tested on that very much. And they've learned that that's the criterion standard of many high school kind of tests and things and the texts. And what often we're asking them to do something very different. We often don't even care they have a comprehensive understanding. Do you get the main point and how it relates to the class? It's useful to have a comprehensive understanding, but also argumentative texts are quite different. We want them to have an opinion about it. What is your opinion about the Krebs cycle? What? That doesn't make sense, right? Like what? So we haven't read very much argumentative. I think things are a little bit different now in K-12, but I never read argumentative essays. I cannot think of a single instance. I mean, it's been a long time, but I never read a nonfiction book. I didn't read essays. I didn't read research articles. I was reading textbooks or short stories or poems, and that's it. And then so we're very, very fundamental level what we're asking them to do. So it is so at some level it is about confidence.
Mm-hmm.
We can ask why they don't have the confidence. Well, they haven't done it.
Right.
Number one. Number two, I'd say the social relationship to the author and the text and the instructor is very different. In high school, you're trying to find out, even in literature, we say that's, subjective, interpretive. No, that's not what most high school students are doing. They're trying to figure out, what did the author mean? Which means, what does the teacher think the author meant? Because that's what they're talking about. And then the student's supposed to figure out what the author meant, and then give the preferred interpretation back to the teacher about what the author meant. You get to college and they say the author is dead. We don't care what the author meant in most literature. Mm-hmm. This is even in fiction, so it's outside of my field, but we say, what sense do you make of the text, and how and why is it coherent? And in fact, you might point out some contradiction that the author wasn't even aware of. Or there could be revealing, so people are reading 18th century literature through a 21st century lens to examine things about class and race and colonial, all kinds of things that the author themselves were not thinking about whatsoever. That is an example of how radically different these kinds of readings can be at a fundamental level. And I think you've exemplified that. So the students were saying they didn't even know that they'd been thoroughly conditioned to read in this way, and that there's an entirely other different way of reading, and that you were asking them to do that. And then the assignments asked them to do that and then write about it.
Well, you know what? Yeah, this is really interesting, because I remember one of the gripes I had with Princeton's precept model.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember they came out with a whole booklet on, the ideal precept. And it's like,
you're one of the two people who've read it.
Oh, but it was
like you.
All right. So it was like this, you're supposed to have this engaging discussion where you're supposed to be sharing your opinions, but that assumes a deep understanding, comprehension of the text itself.
Right.
And the students, like I say, they come as 18-year-olds where they have no training in that. And then we're like, well, now you're supposed to have this great discussion. And so what happens is, most of them keep quiet because they don't want to embarrass. They think they're going to embarrass themselves or be exposed through their imposter syndrome to not know anything. So they're just like, okay, I'm just going to be quiet. And then you get one or two students who just think they know everything in the world, and they just spout off, and if the professor kind of latches onto that, it's pretty easy for them to have a conversation between two or three people, the professor and two or three students, and everyone else is quiet, and they don't get anything out of precepts.
That's right.
So besides the fact that they feel stupid. So
I would even unpack that dynamic. I think that's important to say that one or two people are engaging. This is a common thing that Princeton students say. I'm guessing that those students have particular profiles. Not only do they think they know a lot, and maybe they do. So they may have read or studied something, or they somehow know about French literature because their parents are French literature. Who knows, all kinds of ways. Or they went to a prep school and they are familiar with this kind of discursive Socratic method and the Harkness seminar, and they're familiar with it. I think what's different but there's another thing going on here. You talk about people having opinions. So I think there's demonstrable evidence that in a lot of K-12 contexts, what's being encouraged is for students to express themselves and to articulate his opinion. Very much less evaluation of the justifications for those opinions, for the cogency of those opinions.
Hmm.
And so that's another phenomenon, right? And being a preceptor, you probably saw this. People, they're having an opinion or reaction to the text, but it is so idiosyncratic to them,
Right.
and outside the boundaries of the class or the unit that week, or even just what a literary critic would do, or a philosopher, is like, that it's people, the instructors are just stunned. They just don't know what to do with that. And students say, yeah, when this person talks, the professor validates them and says, yeah, good analysis. And when I had a student say this the other day, then when I say something, the professor doesn't say anything. And so the student said to the professor, why don't you respond to me? He asked them.
Wow.
This professor said, because I never thought of the text in that way. I don't even know what to think about it. It's such an different way of reading it. Now, on the one hand, that could be, as a 22-year-old, making some incredible insight into the literature. But more likely, that this expert hasn't done, but more likely is you're just kind of out of bounds. You're just reading in a way that is not conventional to a historian or a philosopher or a anthropologist. Does that make it wrong? No. But classes are about something and not about other things. And there are conventional ways of reading that are aligned, coupled with the discipline. That makes sense? Like,
Yeah.
and there are some that are outside that. And it's some abstract level. That's a valid reading. That's a valid reading. They made it. But that's not what we're doing. We're reading in the context of an anthropology class, in this course, on this topic, in this discipline, and not that one. And that's not that theoretical orientation, or not a theoretical. That's not the enterprise we are engaged in a university level course. We're doing something else, but it's so basic, no one even thinks to say it. And the students don't even know what that means.
Right.
What do you mean to read like a post-structural Africanist anthropologist who is a social interpretivist and is challenging the dogma of the physical anthropology? Like, what? That's what's going on, though. That is what's going on. That's what's happening in the article. But how do you even explain that to somebody who's 18? Like, I don't know.
Well, what's interesting, I mean, what I appreciate is, well, for that student who is, let's say, out of bounds with their one, they want to be validated and they're not. So it's like, and so that might be a new experience for them.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, you might be wrong. That's actually an experience perhaps you have not yet had, but that is one that you grow, you will have and should learn how to deal with. So you could be wrong. But then secondly, just any old opinion needs to be grounded in some theoretical framework. And so part of what the university is doing is trying to, at least theoretically, is trying to give you that framework in order to have a lens or a perspective on a particular text.
Well, yeah. When you said, I just want to clarify one thing. You said any opinion has to be grounded in an academic and scholarly context to be considered valid. It does. Especially by the people in the discipline. So if you're trying to make an anthropological or historical argument to a historian, then it has to be. They're going to hold you to that. And then that is not some universal thing. It's also a particular framework. And that's where students get confused, rightfully so. The professors are saying, hey, you can take any perspective you want and argue any analytical lens and read the materials. But if they actually, by mistake or happenstance, take a position that counters the theoretical convention of their professor, they are doomed. They don't even know that they've done that. And if the professor is not conscious and aware that, hey, I'm trying to cultivate historical thinking, not historical thinking like my brand of historian, they can easily just chop that student down, because of course the student could never make a compelling argument. This is their third class in history. The professor's been doing it 30 years. There's no way they could ever make a convincing case. Does that make sense? So, and I think this happens a lot. And then
Right. So what?
students say, oh, let me finish the thought. And the
Yeah.
students say, you say I can write about anything I want, but when I do, I get a bad grade. Forget it. I'm just going to give you what I think you want.
Right. That's I was kind of going to go down that road because it'd be easy to just say, let's say that first paper, you're like, yeah, I took I really went for it. Like took a risk and I gave this opinion and I got a C minus and just got cut down. So I'm gonna kind of not gamify, but like just gonna treat this as a series of hoops that I just jumped through to get the good grade.
Mm-hmm.
And I could see almost at least two ways in which it can be demotivating. One, if just that, like, okay, I just, the professor just wants to replicate himself or herself in everyone's mind. So I just have to spit back to them what they want.
Right.
That's demotivating. It's also, I mean, in a way, it's a good exercise to learn how to read from a particular academic
Mm-hmm.
theoretical context. Like read like an anthropologist, read like a psychologist, read
Right.
like an economist. Those are really healthy ways, but I think there could be a temptation to see that as just reductionistic and somehow challenging my individuality, right? I mean, do you see that in students as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that if we're not explicit, these are reasonable interpretations and responses on the part of the students in some ways that experts in a field, I'd say ideally would have some responsibility to say something like, you've done this very unconventional reading. Like going back to the story, that if I were to inhabit that professor with the student said, I don't know. He says, I don't know what to say to what you said because it's outside of so unfamiliar to me. You might say, okay, now it could be unfamiliar because you're adopted a perspective that's not in my field, that's why I don't recognize it as kind of making sense, or it could be because you didn't make a very cogent explanation. As an illogical person, I can sort of see the gaps. Let's assume it's the first.
Right.
Then I could say something like, in this class, we are learning how to read like anthropologists, not historians or psychologists or whatever the subject matter is. And then in particular ones, and you'll remember from the syllabus and the big ideas we've talked about, and we've come this far, these are the principles, these are the concepts we're using to do the reading. And we're not using these others for a variety of reasons. And when I hear your reading, you're not using those. You're doing something else. Is it wrong? No. Is it bad? Not necessarily, but it is not what we're doing here. Let me teach you how to do that.
And
That's not the agreement we have when you signed up for the class.
right.
The class is about this. Now, if you want to, I could even create a situation as a professor where like you can do whatever you want in your writing, but when we're talking in class about the texts, I have an agenda. These are the objectives. These are the things I want to do. I want people to learn how to do this thing. It's not the only way to read. There's all kinds of other ones. And in fact, there's a place in the world to read outside of any boundaries. That's awesome too. That's just not what we're doing. If that in case is what the professor is doing.
I was just thinking, one is to do that well requires a healthy self-awareness on the part of the professor.
Absolutely.
And they probably don't do that because they just jump right into the class and off you go. So the burden on the student is astronomical because you have to, one, figure that out by yourself, two, not give into the temptation to just spit back what they want if you're really going to learn and grow as an individual. And then just
be engaged.
What's that?
And be engaged.
Yeah, and be engaged. And that's really, I mean, you want that so desperately for them because that is enriching, but that's a lonely, tough road to travel.
Yeah, I've had a number of conversations with students so I coach students. So they're like, okay, I've got this paper at this angle. I know it's counter to the professor and they're in anguish. Okay, it's a risk. I'm going to get a worse grade. And, the ones that stand out to me are when they say, screw it, I'm going to do it anyways. And they're like, I'm fine with the result.
That's cool. Yeah.
And I kind of remember doing that too a few times. Like, often I was very instrumental, so I would usually do the path of least resistance to get the best grade. But on a few occasions, I said, you know what, I want to do this, and I'm going to do it. And in fact, those are the ones I remember, and almost always the ones I did, I got better grades. Um, so I think, so from that point of view, I believe that pushing yourself to say, how would I know this person is largely going to is going to be oriented to disagree with me. That actually forces me to think harder, deeper, better,
Well,
right? That knowing that actually is good for writing and thinking clearly, I'd say, and comprehensively. But then I think we are getting at this on the teacher side. You have to be to show restraint. Like I learned this when I was grading writing. Like in grad school, basically, we're trained to critique these scholars. Like we get good at it. So if a student writes a paper, I can tear it apart if I want to. I can find all the things that are wrong with it if I want to. It's not hard. The question is, can I find the things that are right about it and good about it and nurture them and cultivate it and be fair and but not go too far the other way either.
right,
Like
right.
anything they write, it's fine, it's good. Because no one writes and we just want them to write. Well, not in college. I don't think that's right. I don't agree with that. It has to be reasoned and cogent and supported. And these are these conventions. These are legitimate ways of making knowledge that the university has. You have to, these are tried and true, not to say there can't be question, but these are these ways, these conventions and agreements we have come to as a field about how to create useful knowledge. And if you want to participate in the community, you got to learn how to do that. And I'm going to teach you how to do that. But that doesn't mean I want to hold you to the standard of a PhD scholar. We also have to have a developmental perspective. Okay, what's a reasonable thing for me to expect of them? And what actually are they trying to do to see what Mike Rose called the genius or the brilliance of the error? They're trying to do this thing in their thinking and their writing based on their reading that they're not equipped to do, but I can see the impulse. Oh, they're trying to do a synthesis of these different things and put this thing in question. Wow, that's an ambitious intellectual enterprise. I want to nurture that and recognize that and see that, you know, you could have been safe and just did this thing and gave me back what I wanted, but you didn't. You failed miserably because you didn't know how to do it. And then how do I, as a teacher, balance those things, right? I'm not saying it's a simple thing, but I think sometimes it's really easy to get into the mode of just looking for what's wrong in a paper,
Right.
or whatever, or
Right.
problem.
Yeah, I was. You reminded me of this when I was at Princeton Seminary and as a precepting classes over there. And there's this famous. I don't want to bore you with the story, but I'll make it quick. But there was, at the time, the one theologian that was really celebrated over there was a guy named Karl Barth, who, during he was part of a thing called the Barmen Declaration during World War II against Hitler. He was a German. Was he German or Swiss? I can't remember. But anyway, Karl Barth. Anyway, very famous, probably the most influential theologian of the 20th century. And there was a lot of Barth scholars at the seminary. And so I think I was just precepting the theology 101 class, but it was very Barth intensive. And so people were literally just spitting back Barth to people. And I remember there's this one question about the church, and that supposed to have a Christological meaning, like a Christ-centered view of it, and everyone gave the Barth answer, and then like as if that was not just Barth's interpretation, but the way we're supposed to look at it. And then one student's like, well, I don't know if this is right. Is it biblical? He just went off on this, and I gave him the best grade because I'm like, amen. Like you're, instead of just, as we were talking about before, instead of just kind of taking the posture of like, just fill me up and I'll dump it back. He had the guts to challenge that. And I was like so appreciative of that. I wanted to make sure he was rewarded accordingly. So
yeah, that brings us back to a theme before, so maybe we can kind of end up here. I think the fundamental purpose of higher education, universities, certainly places like Princeton, not everywhere, is to cultivate this kind of this critical thinking, to question
Yep.
But it's not no holds barred questioning. There's not questioning anything. There's ways of challenging, questioning, critiquing. Does that make sense? Like,
Yeah, totally.
and I think that's there's a disjuncture there. So we're saying we want you to think critically, and to some extent, critical thinking will come, and I suspect for this student, from their particular perspective and commitments. So this person probably I don't know, maybe they don't know all the theology and different theories and philosophies, but he could say, well, I do know the Bible, and I know that's a relevant lens. Hey, and so that's a move. But
Right.
I think a lot of times students they don't have that, or they're bringing something, a critique that's not recognizable. It's not even legible to the expert. And then what do you do with that as a teacher? I think that's a real dilemma. But I'm not sure we really explain to students. Yes, we want you to think critically, to have an opinion, but then the range of possibilities then is massive. It's much simpler for
Mm.
all concerned to say, what did the author say? Tell me back what they said.
Well,
And
I feel,
so,
go ahead. Sorry.
that was the convention of high school, and it has a legitimate purpose, actually. And the purpose of a liberal arts education and the research university to create knowledge, especially in the humanities, social sciences, that's a legitimate perspective too. But that's a pretty big jump, it seems to me. And I'm not sure that we're always equipping students to do it. And then really recognizing that they're going to have some missteps along the way.
Right. Yeah, and I think that path of least resistance, it's there's also a transactional component of it, because a lot of these students are coming in, they're just thinking, well, the internship, the job, and and that's a legitimate concern, because they are having to, they're going to graduate, they need to make a living, and
That's right.
so and there's a lot of demands on them in the college. So I just want to make sure we appreciate the temptation to kind of take that posture of like, okay, what do I need to do to get the good grade and move on, versus the really, what I would think of hope is the approach of, no, I do want to do well, but ultimately becoming a good critical thinker, someone who understands context and can know, oh, I'm in this context and this is how they're approaching it, but that, even, and then can challenge, um, after understanding that context and studying that context, saying, well, maybe here's the limitations of that context
Yeah.
based on my uh,
Mhm.
study of it. Those are the people who I think, one, have a much richer experience, but then they're the critical thinkers who are going to have at least intellectually and perhaps professionally, a much more richer engagement in life after college as well, I would say.
Well, I think that's great. I think that's really useful. So we got to the level of motivation there. So this is the
Right.
motivation to do well academically and maybe even acquire some knowledge that's applicable to the next thing. And so that's very much what high schools are, many students are at Princeton because they're so motivated to get through high school to a place like Princeton. And so that's a mindset. And then there's another, I think many students also want to learn and learn how to do things. And that's another motivation, but they can depart, right? They can split.
Mhm. Right.
But there's another motivation that we have to be aware of too, which is the aversive motivation. I'm confused a lot. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with this text. I've tried and I'm frustrated. Then what does that redound back to my sense of self? Can I tolerate this
Mhm.
confusion and
Right.
frustration?
Right.
Cannot, right? So that's operating a lot. I
Yeah.
remember that. I remember in grad school, like, am I supposed to understand this? Am I stupid? Are other people understanding this? Like, I was just laughing out loud. I couldn't understand any of the stuff that Foucault was saying. It was just like, I found it ludicrous.
Right.
It was just comical that how little I understood. But at some level, I was also very doubtful and uncertain about not just my ability to understand and know what was expected of me, but what does that mean about me? I think this is operating and is actually very aversive. And I'll connect this back to one thing I haven't said yet, but it's, around 20 years ago, maybe a little bit more, the proliferation of information technology and digital text, PDFs, accessibility of resources, a huge thing happened in college and university reading. Effectively, professors had almost no limitations on the texts that they could assign. Even though these texts were not written for students, they're not instructional, they're not like a textbook, they're written for scholars, they presume a lot of background knowledge, a lot of specialization, they're obscure. There's also the amount that they could assign, but they didn't change the way they teach. When I was in mid-80s, when I was an undergrad, in sociology, I got a textbook. Anthropology, I got a textbook. They don't do that now, not at Berkeley or Princeton. It's scholarly articles, it's research articles. How much knowledge and background and context do you need to make sense of these? So a lot of this is we've changed the reading demands in a variety of ways without actually changing the instruction. And we've changed them to make these harder, more specialized texts that are further away from what they were asked to do in high school. So if you give me, I read a bunch of textbooks, conventional hardback textbooks in high school, different subject matter. I didn't have sociology and anthropology, but if you give me one in college, I kind of know what to do with that thing. But if you give me an ethnography or an extended philosophical essay, so in my philosophy class, I had textbooks. I didn't read. Then when I went to it later, then I was reading Hume and Bacon, and I was totally overwhelmed. I didn't know how to read these disquisitions, right? These discourses. But the point is, this was invisible. And a bunch of other things happen. Then you can assign a chapter out of context because it costs nothing. You don't have to buy the whole book. You can excerpt texts and piece them, put them together, and all these Frankenstein texts, assigned readings. But that's what a textbook does, is it takes these things and then ties them together and links them and explains them, the relationships. And so even if that's done, I'll stop on this point. The common teaching practice is simply to say, read this. Then after the students have read it, maybe when you get to class, the professor provides that context. Well, of course, that would have been much more useful at the front end. So the teaching practices have not kept up with the fundamental access and the way we've made decisions about how to teach. And so combined with changes in students reading out of K-12, I think are a greater mismatch. So college reading has gotten harder. No one recognizes this. High school reading, students are reading less and less in school and outside of school. So that gap is greater. So they're experiencing more confusion, more frustration, more uncertainty, more doubt, right? And so that gap can be even more insurmountable, seems to me.
All right. So, but
on that optimistic note,
yeah, we're not going to end in despair. We're going to, but I think it's good for students. I think it's good for folks to recognize that, and just so, because, yeah, like I think it can lead to an even more severe case of imposter syndrome, because there's these expectations, and you're admitted, so you assume they assume that you know how to do this and do it well from day one, and you don't. So thankfully you're doing these seminars, and even here in this short talk, there's probably 20 strategies you're going to discuss in these workshops, but what is there, like, the first key thing that students can do, and even like young professionals, because they're facing
absolutely, that's right.
Well. So and all this, so what is there, not say there's like the key, but is there like the first thing that's really important for all of us to do in these types of situations where we're confused and not sure what?
Well, let me come back to one of the initial points we made. So reading is fundamentally about the knowledge you bring to the text. The text is incomplete and it's a code. So the way you make that text make sense is by what you bring to the text. knowledge of the domain, knowledge of the purpose, knowledge of the context, knowledge of the conventions of the text and how it's structured. So if you want to read better, it's not purely a process of strategies. Strategies and processes are contentless, but reading is fundamentally about knowledge.
Mhm.
And so ironically, you can read this text better by learning something about the subject matter. That doesn't sound like a reading strategy, right? But it is. Or you can learn about the conventions of research articles
Mm.
or the application, all kinds of things. So I'd say that's the main thing I would say, is that reading is an act of bringing your knowledge to the text. And that's a very different way than most people think. Most people think exactly the opposite. You're trying to pull out, extract, absorb. So and then that points to a bunch of different kinds of strategies.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, not to contradict you at all. It's
Yeah,
more,
yeah.
I was just saying, this is why we made our creative problem solving course free, because you're in this situation in which you're overwhelmed, you're not sure what to do. It's a challenging thing, and there's temptations, to somehow fight it, to flee, freeze. And we're saying, okay, this is one practical way in which you just need to apply your creative problem solving skills. And the first step of that is being self-aware of how you tend to react
That's right.
in this
Exactly.
situation, and how to become defensive. Is it imposter syndrome type of scenario, or do you just be quiet in precepts, or do you just try to get through as best you can? There's all these ways. And if that, again, so I want to encourage people to start working on our creative problem solving course, which is free. But yeah, Nic, thanks so much. Any last thoughts before we go, or was that point good about the knowledge you bring to the text?
Well, I think even a more abstract than that is, or more general than that is, reading is a complicated process that you learn by doing.
Hmm.
So you can learn about reading, and that's useful, but in the end, like any practice, you have to do it, and do it a lot, actually.
Right.
Be patient with oneself.
True. All right. Well, thank you, Nic. This is great. I really do appreciate the fact that you're doing these workshops for students. I mean, it's just a lifeline for a lot of students. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's fun.
All right. Until next week. Take care.
All right. Take care, Matt.
Bye-bye.